It's as if I talk to empty air and silent walls. I need to hear from you, wrestling with your perfect time and desperate for some little sign. I need you to come through. Be still and know is oh so far beyond me, but thy will be done is still the prayer I'm singing. I wait, I trust, I lift it up and I let it go, knowing how you hold my fear, my want, my hurt, my heart. Oh, I let it go to you, and I wait. You know I've been here before. I fought the world, kicked in the doors and found no comfort there. Only when I walk the path, your hand in mine, and then look back to peace become my prayer. No fear in love, the words that you are whispering. All things in time and all things in your keeping. So I wait, I trust, I lift it up and I let it go, knowing how you hold my fear, my want, my hurt, my heart. Oh, I let it go to you, and I wait. In the deepest dark, in the night so long, you are still the light, you are still my song. So I wait, I trust, I lift it up and I let it go, knowing how you hold my fear, my want, my hurt, my heart. Oh, I let it go to you, and I wait. I wait.
Kathy Tricoli has some beautiful praise and worship music, that's for sure. Thank you, Donna, for sharing that. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and welcome to today's teaching on types and shadows. We continue teaching on types and shadows, and today it's lessons of the leaven. And we will not get through all the lessons of the leaven today, but we will establish a stronger foundation, and it will prepare us for the upcoming Passover season and unleavened bread. And that is important because most of us were not raised with his feast days. We were raised with the man-made holidays. And so for many of us, this is new, and we have much to learn and much to rid ourselves of that old leaven that Paul speaks of. So I really pray that this is a blessing. Please know it is a very deep topic. And I know each time we come together, he will mature us and teach us, and we'll become stronger and stronger in him and know more about our groom. So knowing Yahuah's covenant commands has everything to do with recognizing the leaven that affects us for the good towards our maturity, because there is a way to be leavened toward maturity, or for the bad leaven that grieves the Ruach HaKodesh. But how many believers even know what our marriage covenant commands are? Do believers understand the significance of saying yes to Yahusha? How many know that with a change in priesthood comes a change in law? What is the believer's moral compass concerning respecting and honoring our groom? Do believers know what priesthood they were under? Do they even care to know? This Shabbat, may Yah reveal insights through our gathering to help his bride find his narrow path, the very wedding aisle where she will behold him. There were two blood-ratified marriage proposals to Israel in the Bible. The first took place at Mount Sinai. That particular marriage covenant was broken, right? Due to what? Actually, it was broken due to leaven. And that leaven at that time came in the form of sinning with the golden calf. And the second marriage proposal took place with Yahusha in the New Testament as the Lamb of Elohim that fulfilled the death penalty arm of the conditional promise requested and given to Abraham in Genesis 15 with the flaying of the animals. Because since Abraham requested, a guarantee, and the promise became conditional, if the covenant was broken, then someone would have to die. And Yahusha knew that he would lay down his life and take it back up again. So we would once again be connected to the unconditional promise of Yah given to Abraham in Genesis 12. We all know the four elements of a blood-ratified covenant. And a blood-ratified covenant cannot be added to or taken away from. And we know those four components are proposal, acceptance of that proposal, blood ratification, and a covenant confirming meal. And that's what this upcoming Passover is all about. Because Yahuah so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but receive everlasting life. And through his blood, they can be saved. They can receive what he did for them. The first mention of leaven is in Exodus chapter 12, verse 15. There is a principle of Bible study called the law of first mention that says the first time a thing, a word, a phrase is mentioned in the Bible influences how it should be interpreted throughout his word. So we find the first mention of leaven in Exodus chapter 12 that tells us about the Passover. And we read, and the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I shall pass over you, and let the plague not come on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And this day shall become to you a remembrance, and you shall celebrate it as a festival to Yahuah throughout your generations. Celebrate it as a festival, an everlasting law. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Indeed, on the first day you cause leaven to cease from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that being shall be cut off from Israel. And down to verse 19. For 7 days no leaven is to be found in your houses, for if anyone eats what is leavened, that same being shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether sojourner or native of the land. This is teaching his people as that he brought out of Egypt the lesson of the leaven, because the leaven of bread was something that they could see and understand. in the natural realm. But the ultimate purpose of removing the leaven is to take out the old leaven that we have filled ourselves with while we live in Egyptian quote unquote slavery, and purge that out and receive his pure word. Other instructions soon follow about not mixing offerings of worship with leaven. Leaven is a type and shadow focusing on the law of Kilyayim. This law tells us not to mix clean with unclean. In this particular scripture, leaven would be considered unclean, and it should not be mixed with what his word tells us how to properly present the offerings. And we see that leaven in Exodus chapter 12, verse 15, is defined as CR, yeast cake, as swelling by fermentation. And this particular definition of leaven occurs 5 times. And so we have it occurring in these 2 locations as CR, yeast cake, as swelling by fermentation. And we also see it in Exodus 13:7, Leviticus 2:11, and Deuteronomy 16:4, CR. Now, in Exodus 34:25, we see, "Thou shalt not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, neither shall the sacrifice of the feast of the Passover be left until the morning." So here we have leaven as Strong's Hebrew number 2557. And that means hamatz. And that also means ferment, leaven, as in leavened bread, hamatz. In Genesis 19:3, we see unleavened bread defined as matzah. And so this was when the angels went on to Sodom and rescued Lot. And in Genesis 19:3, we see, "And he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him and entered into his house. And he," meaning Lot, "made them a feast and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat." So that is called matzah, in the sense of greedily devouring for sweetness, properly sweetness, concretely sweet. The festival of Passover, because no leaven was then used, unleavened, without leaven. Then also we see bread defined as lechem. So lechem is food, especially bread or grain. So it can be food, it can be fruit, it can be a loaf, it can be meat, it can be victuals. So that is the other Hebrew name for bread, is lechem. In the New Testament, we run across yet another definition in Greek. Strong's Greek definition of bread is G740, and it equates to showbread. And we know the showbread table was in the tabernacle. But look at, in addition to the G740, which throughout these scriptures defines bread as artos, when it comes to Matthew chapter 12, verse 4, with showbread, it not only defines it as artos, but also prothesis. It's a setting forth, specifically the showbread in the temple, as exposed before God. You know, Panaim to Panaim, face to face, the showbread. So it is a raised loaf artos is a raised loaf, and the showbread was a raised loaf as well. So here in Exodus 25:30, and thou shalt set upon the table showbread. So that is defined again as lechem in Hebrew. And before, just the word before means panayim, face to face, if you will. And then if you look further down on 1 Chronicles 23:29, showbread has yet another definition. Hebrew 46:35, marketh, an arrangement that is concretely a pile of loaves, one on top of another, showbread. So in Greek, it's referred to as artos and also prothesis. All of these terms are connected to the term showbread. And it's interesting to understand what the fermentation process is all about to leaven bread. It's actually like a breathing process. And I just took a couple of clips from some bloggers that kind of tells us what's going on with the fermentation process. This one says wild yeast and lab, meaning lactic acid bacteria, are aerotolerant anaerobes, meaning they organically multiply in the presence of oxygen. Airflow is essential to a new starter created by loosening the lid of the jar. Another reason for a loose-fitting cover is the rising air pressure from the CO2 released, which can force a glass jar to explode. For this reason, only loosely seal the lid of a mature starter tube. And she put a note, lactic acid bacteria will also appear in long fermented yeast leavened bread. Preferments such as Biga or Polish use the organic acids produced to enhance maturity of the bread. So this is going to be interesting because there's a need for bread to breathe. And just like we breathe in air and we exhale CO2, and so it's living. And God is the manna from heaven. He is the bread of life. And he is in us and we are in him. On the other side of the screen, it talks further about carbon dioxide is the primary leavening agent in many breads, including sourdough. As CO2 is produced within the dough, it causes the dough to expand. This results in the airy and porous structure characteristics of bread. Gluten network of the dough traps CO2 gases, which creates pockets in the dough. When baked, these pockets become the holes or crumb of the bread. The activity and quantity of yeast determine the size and distribution of these holes. Bacterial activity. Bacteria in sourdough, particularly lactic acid bacteria, produce organic acids, which imparts the characteristic tangy flavor of sourdough. While these acids don't cause rise like CO2, they contribute to the dough's elasticity and extensibility, assisting in trapping the CO2 produced by yeast. So the fermentation to leaven bread is like a breathing process. It's alive, it's manifesting, it's growing. We next read about leaven in the book of the covenant, and that appears in Exodus 23:14 through 18. 3 times in the year, you are to celebrate a festival to me. Guard the festival of Matzot. That's unleavened bread. 7 days you eat unleavened bread as I commanded you. at the time appointed in the new month of Aviv, for in it you came out of Egypt. And do not appear before me empty-handed. And the festival of the harvest, the first fruits of your labors, which you have sown in the field, and the festival of the ingathering at the outgoing of the year, when you have gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. So that's speaking of Shavuot, the festival of weeks, and Sukkot, festival of booths. 3 times in the year, all your males are to appear before the Master Yahuah. Do not slaughter the blood of my slaughtering with leavened bread, and the fat of my festival shall not remain until morning. So leavened loaves and feast are all applicable to believers' lives today. We are all under one law. We observe his feast days. So we must keep that in mind, because many just want to throw away the Old Testament of the Bible, throw away the front of the book, which is incorrect, because sadly they have not been taught, and frankly, most of us were not taught how to rightly divide his word of truth. So this appears in covenant Torah, and we're going to get more into that so people will know what law they are under. They are under covenant Torah, covenant law. And then we see that 7 days you are to eat unleavened bread, and that's matzah. And that's where the festival gets its name, matzot, from unleavened bread. But we also see that his feast days also were meant to be followed while they were under the tutor, the book of the law. And we see that in Leviticus 23. So after the sin of the golden calf and the breaking of the book of the covenant, which was their marriage proposal that Israelites had accepted at Mount Sinai, and after Moses interceded and they received the imposed book of the law to spare their very lives, they were still to honor Yah's feast. Yah's feasts are listed right here. It's in Exodus 23 and also recorded in Leviticus 23. So Exodus 23, same numbers, right? Exodus 23 and Leviticus 23 is where you can read about his feast. So that's easier to remember. But under covenant law, under covenant Torah, under our marriage covenant, we are to follow his feast. Why? Because they are listed in the book of the covenant. So the breaking of the covenant caused a shift. This shift shows the change in priesthoods and change in laws to be administered. This is where most believers get tripped up. The book of the covenant and the book of the law are not synonymous. Simply put, after the sin of the golden calf, where Aaron and the Israelites added leaven or mixing how they chose to worship Yahuah, it caused a great explosion. I mean, Moses came down from the mount with Joshua, and he had the tablets of the covenant, and he just threw them on the ground. Why? Because they had broken their marriage covenant. Within 40 days, they had broken their marriage covenant. So this explosion of leaven, the sin of the golden calf, caused a shift. The royal Melchizedek priesthood, a set-apart people that he so desired to make them a kingdom of priests, plural, under the book of the covenant and royal Torah, it shifted to becoming a nation with a singular priest under the Aaronic Levitical priesthood. And that priesthood would implement the harsh schoolmaster of the book of the law to teach them Yahweh's word and ways. So to rid ourselves of leaven, what do we need to know? We need to know what law we are under. Because if we know what law we are under and what priest we are under, then we know what is pleasing to Yahuah and what is not. So if that shift is not made, then you can be very much deceived. You can even be encouraged to go back to doing animal sacrifices of bulls and goats and sheep. And so we must know what law we are under, because otherwise our lives, we can easily be led astray, and we can unknowingly or knowingly add leaven to our lives. So leaven in Leviticus 23:17 is the definition hamatz. It means fermented. So I just want you to become more familiar when you see the term leaven, and when you research how many times does it appear in scripture. You not only have to search the word, you have to search, you know, the Strong's number, because you're going to get different results. So Passover is right around the corner. It will be on the 2nd of April, 2024. And then it's followed by 7 days of unleavened bread. And we also go into counting of the Omer. And that starts on the 7th of April is the first day. And then the numbers pick up. You see, you know, on April 10th is the 4th count of the Omer, and so forth, all the way to the 50th day, which is Shavuot. So they even put in the subtitle of the calendar, from the day of the wave sheaf offering. So the day of the wave sheaf offering is on the 7th of April. And you just count the 50 days to Shavuot. In a previous teaching, I broke down what exactly is in the Book of the Covenant. And the Book of the Covenant, his marriage proposal, the first blood ratified marriage proposal to the Israelites, is listed in Exodus chapter 19. You could start with verse 1 or verse 4. It's Exodus 19, if you will, all the way through to Exodus 24:11. Okay, so that's the Book of the Covenant. And it's subtitled in our Bibles even to show you that the 10 Commandments is in the Book of the Covenants, idolatry is forbidden, the altar of sacrifice explained, laws for servants, personal injury laws, laws about restitution, property laws, laws of social responsibility, justice and mercy, Sabbath laws, the 3 yearly feasts right there in Exodus 23, and how Yah's angel would lead us. And the covenant confirming meal is listed right there. Lastly, in Exodus 24, verses 9 through 11 is specifically with the covenant confirming meal. So the new covenant gospel message updated and expounded on the Book of the Covenant, because the new covenant is the most current instructions given by Yahusha HaMashiach himself. And so we have to be mindful of that, and also understand that this, as you see on your screen, is the parameters of the Book of the Covenant, the first marriage proposal. Now, the royal Torah consists of his covenant commands from Genesis 1:1 to the time of his marriage proposal and covenant that begins right here in Exodus 19:4 through Exodus 24:11. And it's inclusive of the Book of the Covenant. So even though this is a segment for the Book of the Covenant, but it's also the royal covenant. It's inclusive to that. So The royal Torah consists of his covenant commands from Genesis 1:1 to the time of his marriage proposal and covenant that begins in Exodus 19:4 through Exodus 24:11. And that is inclusive. So the book of the covenant is inclusive in the royal Torah. It is all covenant Torah. And James mentions the royal covenant or the royal law in James chapter 2, verse 8. If you fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, you do well. So this is verbiage. This is defining what law you are under. We are under royal law, covenant Torah. From that point, after Exodus 24:11, the sin of the golden calf takes place when Moses and Joshua came down from the mount. So this begins a whole different season of being under the book of the law, which was and is the harsh schoolmaster that would be implemented until, extremely important word, until Yahusha would come and restore the Melchizedek priesthood back to its reigning position. He himself now reigns and is seated at the right hand of the Father and is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And he is from the tribe of Judah. The New Testament, which reveals and manifests this truth, was articulated through the remedial teachings of the book of the law. It was all pointing to Yahusha, along with all the prophecies that are written by the prophets and the writings of the Old Testament. It was all pointing to Yahusha, the one new man. He is the head, we are the body. In the New Testament, Yahusha, Jesus of Nazareth, came to fulfill all righteousness and usher in the new blood ratified covenant with his precious blood. As mentioned before, this connected us back to the promise of Abraham in Genesis 12. So knowing the difference between covenant Torah and the book of the law is extremely important to identify leaven in our lives. That's really the only way we can tell if we have leaven is if our lives do not align with covenant Torah, then how are we going to know what to remove? What old leaven will we know what to remove? What old leaven will we see that doesn't align? So that's why it's so important, because the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herods want you to be submissive to their added doctrines and their commands beyond the word of Elohim, right? Right. So if they add some stuff and you go, oh, okay, we're supposed to do this, we're supposed to do this, we're supposed to keep 613 commandments, we're supposed to, oh, well, we can't do the sacrifices because we're not back in the land. And what? How do you know what to do, what not to do? How do you know what's added, what's not added? You only know that by knowing that you are under covenant Torah. And if you do not understand who your high priest is and what covenant commands you are under versus the book of the law, you are vulnerable to receive added leaven, either from the Pharisees and Sadducees that want to add stuff to his word through the Talmud and other sources, or by worldly governments that want to place laws that are much different than what his word says should be followed. So this scripture in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 11 and 12 is very important, because you have to make this shift. You have to make the shift, or you're going to be sorely confused and vulnerable. Verse 11, truly then, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people were given the Torah, the law, why was there still need for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to the order of Aaron? Now, when it referred to given, for under it the people were given the Torah, that is specifying more specifically the book of the law, because that is what the Levitical priesthood implemented, was the book of the law. Okay. And then verse 12, for the priesthood being changed of necessity, there takes place a change of law also. And it is even footnoted from Melchizedek to Aaron. And then when Yahusha ushered in the new covenant, it shifted back from the Aaronic Levitical priesthood back to the Melchizedek priesthood and restored it back to the reigning position. Very important, and very few fully understand that. There's another parable about the woman who hid 3 measures of meal until it was all leavened. And see, we need to understand this parable too before we get on to the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, because there's leaven that helps mature us by feeding on his word, and there's leaven that takes away from us and grieves the Ruach HaKodesh within us. So we have to be mindful of the different angles to look at leaven. All right. So the woman who hid the 3 measures of meal, that parable is intertwined also with the mustard seed. So let's look at those verses. Another parable he put before them, saying, the rain of the heavens is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is less than all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is greater than the plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the heaven come and dwell in its branches. So that was describing the rain of the heavens. Hallelujah. So that's good. That's a good growth and maturity to the becomes a tree. And it goes on to say in Matthew 13:33, just one sentence about this woman. Another parable he spoke to them, the rain of the heavens is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal until all was leavened. And that's good. That's good. But we again need to understand how much is a measure. And we see here that both parables of the mustard seed and the leaven speak of the kingdom of heaven's growth from something small to something exponentially larger. This leaven parable is unique that it focuses on a woman. We know in Revelation 12, the woman in the wilderness represents Israel, and in Revelation 17, the other woman in the wilderness is the harlot prostitute that rides the beast. So there's 2 women in the wilderness. We must not forget that there are 2. And that those are recorded in the book of Revelation that remind us that the devil counterfeits everything. And everything means everything. In the context of this particular parable, however, it speaks of the woman as Israel, who took and hid the leaven, which is a type and shadow of the rain of the heavens, in 3 measures of meal until it was all leavened. Leaven becomes hidden and unseen once mixed with meal. It does its work from the inside out. This leaven in this particular parable is good. Yah's kingdom of priests reign in their positions, and they build, grow, and nourish his sheep and walk in their kingdom purpose. It is also significant that in this parable, the woman used 3 measures of meal. So we need to find out how much that is and the significance of that amount, because we are not as familiar with their measures as were his disciples. And a seah of measurement is a measure. And that consists of 3 1/3 omers. So before we move on to the next slide, the devil uses the harlot that rides the beast to sneak in his poisonous leaven of sorcery from the outside in. This can bring death, illness, and destruction. Beware of the devil's hidden leaven in food, drink, anything that can be absorbed or anything that can pierce the bodily temple. And also be careful with hidden leaven, things that are added to Yahuah's word, because leaven can relate to spiritual things and his word that we feed upon, and it can relate to physical things that we actually consume. And the devil wants to corrupt both with leaven. And that's the very reason that back in the day, kings had their own bakers and they had their own cupbearers, because they wanted to make sure nothing was added that would harm them, kill them, so forth. So I took this excerpt from Bible Tools, and it goes on to say, she hides the leaven in 3 measures of meal. And a measure is defined as sia or satan, and it's also from the Hebrew origin of sia, from an unused root meaning to define a sia or a certain measure. Okay, so we have the definition of that. Satan, and the Hebrew origin is from sia, a sia measurement. So she hides the leaven in 3 measures of meal. That Yahusha uses the very phrase 3 measures of meal is quite interesting, and it is a key, because this told his Jewish audience something that he did not have to explain, even though we need explanation, as they were familiar with it. It was a normal practice and meant something to them. It has been suggested that he used this amount because it is the average quantity of meal a housewife would employ in her daily baking. This suggestion is pretty ridiculous when we consider that 3 measures of meal equal about 2 gallons of meal. That seems like a lot of bread each day. An average loaf of bread contains about 3 cups of flour. 2 gallons of meal, which is the equivalent of about 8 quarts of 32 cups, would make nearly 11 loaves. Even the most bread-gorging family on this earth would not eat 11 loaves each day. So jumping down to Genesis 18 contains the first biblical usage of 3 measures of meal. So that's the first biblical usage, Genesis 18. This is the occasion when the one who became Yahushua HaMashiach and 2 angels came to Abraham, and he made them a meal. Yahusha tells him in verse 5 of Genesis 18 and verse 6, go ahead and make a meal. So Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal. So there you have. And also, what was 3 measures of meal? There is a principle again of Bible study, the law of first mention. So that is why we went back to the first mention. Here, 3 measures of meal is used in the context of a fellowship meal, giving hospitality, in this case to Yahuah. So it has a spiritual connotation. We know the law of grain offerings in Numbers chapter 15, 8 through 9 provides some instructions. We need to learn a little bit about Israelite dry measures. The smallest unit of measure is an omer. 3 omers equal about 1 sia. This sia is what is translated measure. in Matthew chapter 13, 33, verse 33, which is the parable of the woman. Except it is Greek Satan. So Satan and Sia are interchangeable. And it's 1/3 of an ephah. It had to be of fine flour. Abraham gave 3 seahs, 3 measures. He went above and beyond what was required for the meal offering. Also in Judges chapter 6, Gideon's offering to Yahuah. How much did he give? Gideon gave an ephah, 3 measures of meal. 1 Samuel chapter 124 tells of Hannah's thank offering. How much? Hannah offered 1 ephah, 3 measures of meal. In Ezekiel chapter 45, verse 24, are the offerings given at the feast during the millennium. How much is given? An ephah, 3 measures of meal is given. So 3 1/3 omers equals 1 measure or 1 seah. And in addition, the leaven listed in Matthew chapter 13, 33 is defined by Strong's Greek word 2219 as zume, meaning ferment, as if boiling up leaven. So it's like the starter part. It sounds like the starter point of leaven that was mixed in with the measure, the 3 measures. So this is just a chart to kind of help us understand these measurements a little bit more clearly. So I'll just enlarge it so you can see how much a quart is versus a cab versus an omer. On this picture to the right, they didn't have omer between the cab and the seah, so I just put omer here. An omer is almost 2 cabs. It's 1 4/5 cab, so it's almost 2 cabs. And a seah is 3 1/3 omers. So a seah is 3 1/3 omers, so that's quite a bit. And an ephah is 3 seahs or 10 omers. And we know there was 1 omer in the jar before the Ark of the Covenant, and that's recorded in Exodus chapter 16, verse 33. And 1 omer equals 1/10 of an ephah. So we've already reviewed seah, which equates to the measure. Seah and measure are synonymous in the parable with the woman. Moving on to the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. Now, I'm going to compare the account recorded in Mark and the account recorded in Matthew. So let's just kind of read it from Mark's account, and then I'll show you some of the differences that kind of enrich the parable from those accounts recorded. And the emissaries gathered to Yahusha and reported to him all, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a lonely place and rest a little." For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. And they went away to a lonely place in the boat by themselves. But they saw them going, and many recognized him and ran there on foot from all the cities and came before them and came together to him. And having gone out, Yahusha saw a large crowd and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep, not having a shepherd. And he began to teach them many matters. And as the hour grew late, his taught ones came to him and said, "This is a lonely place, and now the hour is late. Send them away so that they can go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, since they have no food to eat." But he answering said to them, you give them to eat. You give them to eat. Is that not what we're supposed to do, right? We feed on his word, we feed on his covenant commands, and then we take care of his sheep. We teach them and feed them how to rightly divide his word of truth. And we want to be as accurate as possible. He doesn't expect for us to be perfect, but he does want us to be as accurate as possible. He said, you give them to eat. And they said to him, should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them to eat? Then he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. You know, he always brings it down to earth. You know, let's look at the practical. What is in our natural realm? And then he uses that to teach us. Then he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he ordered them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. And they sat down in groups in hundreds and in 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves. So with the feeding of the 5,000, in this particular blessing, I noted that he does look up to the heaven in addition to blessing and breaking the bread, and gave them to his taught ones to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all, and all ate and were satisfied. So that's important, that all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 baskets filled with pieces also from the fish. Now those who ate the loaves were about 5,000 men. So before preparing for this particular gathering today on our Shabbat, I wasn't aware of the size and the differences on those baskets. There's a difference. There's a big difference. And we're going to get into that. So that's important. So likewise, in Matthew's account, he has compassion for them, but in addition, he healed their sick, it's recorded. And again, they record the hour was late. And he again told them to feed them. And it's noted it was 5 loaves and 2 fish. And again, it's recorded that he looked up to heaven and he blessed and broke the bread. So here, this is the account of Matthew's account and Mark's account. And what is highlighted pretty much shows all that took place between both of them. So they're pretty much all in sync, except Mark records that the group sat down in hundreds and in 50s. And Mark's account focuses on teaching them, and Matthew's account focused on he healed their sick. So that's what was going on in those 2 scenarios. And then we move on to when Jesus feeds the 4,000. And I'll just read Mark's account and do a little comparison. In those days, the crowd being very great and not having any to eat, Yahusha called his taught ones near and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, for they have now been with me 3 days and do not have food to eat. If I dismiss them unfed to their home, they shall faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. And his taught ones answered him, how shall anyone be able to feed these people with bread here in the desert? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground. And taking the 7 loaves, giving thanks, it doesn't say he looked up to heaven and gave thanks, but he did give thanks. He broke them and gave them to his taught ones to set before them. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed, he said to set them also before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 7 large baskets of broken pieces. 7 large baskets of broken pieces. That was an adjective I didn't pick up on before, but now I have, and I will share that with all of you. And those eating were about 4,000, and he dismissed them. And immediately entering into the boat with his taught ones, he came to the parts of Dalmanutha. That's a good one. And with Matthew's account, we see that, again, he acknowledges they'd been with him for 3 days. Again, they were in a deserted place, right? Again, 7 loaves of bread and a few fish. He gave thanks, and 7 large baskets is also noted. So there's definitely significance to the baskets because it is recorded as such. And so both Matthew's account and Mark's account are pretty much right on. And then later on, Yahusha starts to explain what all this means. And it's very interesting that right before the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000, the Pharisees were asking for a sign. And isn't it interesting that he was saying, no sign will be given to you, but only the sign of Jonah. So I thought that was very interesting that occurred, and with the eclipse that's going to happen April 8th, and the fact that it kind of begins in an area called Jonah and it goes through Nineveh, I thought that was pretty interesting timing of all of this. So anyway, getting back, so in Mark, this is Yahusha's explanation in Mark's account. And starting in verse 13, it says, and leaving them, again entering into the boat, he went away to the other side. And his disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he was warning them, saying, mind, beware of the leaven, meaning the added stuff. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of the Herods. And they were reasoning with one another, saying, because we have no bread. I mean, I feel compassion for the disciples, because, you know, when going to school and being in a classroom and the teacher, you know, is asking you questions and you're like, okay, do I have the right answer? I don't know. So anyway, can you imagine being there with Yahusha and, you know, him asking you questions about a particular parable? Anyway, so, and they were reasoning with one another, saying, because we have no bread. And Yahusha, being aware of it, said to them, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? In verse 19, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets filled with broken pieces did you pick up? They said to him, 12. Now we will find out that these baskets were not large. And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets filled with broken pieces did you pick up? And they said, 7. And he said to them, how do you not understand? I'm so thankful that he's so patient with us with getting all of this. And so, baskets of leftovers after feeding the 5,000, that definition of that basket is of uncertain size, okay? And a small basket. And the basket of leftovers after feeding the 4,000 is spurious. It's a hamper or lunch receptacle basket. It's large. Okay. Now, in Luke 9:17 and in John 6:13, those two gospels only speak about the 12 baskets of leftovers. They don't reference the 7 baskets of the leftovers from the feeding of the 4,000. But it is recorded that those baskets are the G2894, which were the small baskets. So it's validated that they were small baskets. And for the 4,000, the large basket, we know what size that is when we cross-reference Acts chapter 9, verse 25. When we read, then the disciples took him by night, speaking of Paul, and let him down by the wall in a basket. That basket that could hold Paul is the size of the baskets that were used during the feeding of the 4,000. If y'all knew that, well, congratulations. I did not realize the magnitude of the size of that basket. So I may have analyzed this parable before under that misconception, and I apologize by doing so. Now, with some commentaries, due to the locations of these feedings, some believe the feeding of the 5,000 were mainly to the remnant of the house of Judah that had returned after Babylonian captivity. And regarding the 4,000, some believe those were mainly Gentiles from the Decapolis region. Now, this may be so. I mean, they might be right, but I don't know if we really know because we weren't there. So, I mean, it's a possibility, but it can also kind of muddy the waters because Yahusha himself gives us the main meaning of the feeding of the 5,000 versus the 4,000 in the account recorded in Matthew, which we will get to, because he validates in Matthew chapter 16, verse 12. So it's very important. If you ever get confused about the feeding of 5,000 and 4,000, the main gist of that teaching was Yahusha saying, beware of the leaven in the added teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He was focusing on their teachings. So the key of the 12 baskets tells us Yah's word can feed all 12 tribes. And that's the significance of the 12 baskets. It makes us correlate it to the 12 tribes. He wants us to know his pure word can feed all 12 tribes completely and have some left over, showing that they ate till they were fully content, but they only had 12 small baskets left over. And the 5 loaves remind us of the first 5 books of the Torah, his word, his pure word. Whereas the 7 loaves, we see, well, there's 2 more loaves in the feeding of the 5,000. So it's added. And it was added leaven, and it fed fewer people, yet had greater amounts of leftovers due to the extra leaven that had been added by the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herods. So it made me think of like when a hostess prepares a large feast and the leftovers are abundant, what does that tell the hostess? It tells the hostess that the food served, you know, it was okay. I mean, they were polite and they ate and it met their needs. It was food, it was eaten, but there was a great deal of leftovers. And similarly, this could be and equate to this same type of analogy. So the exact volume of leftovers of 12 small baskets to 7 large baskets is difficult to determine. However, the large baskets could hold a man. So even though the number 7 is smaller than 12, the greater volume of leftovers were in the 7 large baskets. I mean, they say they were like a duffel bag. Yahusha was focusing on how many. And there was also a focus on the volume, because at least we know there were small baskets and there were large baskets, even though the type of basket isn't fully equated to an exact measurement. So we just take that into account. But here's the answer. Here's the answer in Matthew 16:12. But he says in verse 11, how is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, meaning the added stuff that they were adding to Yahuah's word. And then in verse 12, then they understood that he did not say to beware of the leaven of bread, even though that teaches us, that teaches us, it's a type and shadow that teaches us about the spiritual realm, but he was applying it to the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So again, it clearly is speaking of the leaven in both. But in Mark, he kind of leaves it open-ended, and he said to them, how do you not understand? So I'm very thankful that in Matthew's account that we have verse 11 and verse 12. So this is all about the leaven, and it's so very important. You know, it may not be the most exciting topic to delve into, because you really have to put your thinking cap on, and you really have to get behind these definitions and the translations in Hebrew and Greek. And I'm no Hebrew and Greek scholar, so it can be challenging, but it shows our love for him, that we truly do want to understand. And, you know, when he asks us, how do you not understand? We can answer him, well, we really do want to understand. And we're looking up these definitions, and we really want to fully understand about leaven and how it affects us today. So the answer shows us that they understood in Matthew chapter 16, verse 12. Hallelujah for that verse. The key lesson of the leaven is the teaching, the added and twisted doctrines of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herods, the worldly, religious, and governmental entities. So I thought this was pretty interesting. It was from a blog, and it was recorded in the Times of Israel by Jonathan Wolf. And I'd like for us just to review this portion of it. And, you know, he said, why are there 2 words for leaven in the Torah? Well, actually, I think there's more, but let's go with this, okay? Most of us may be familiar with the Hebrew word hamatz as a term used to mean food not kosher for Passover. We associate the phrase hamatz and matzah with the Passover Seder as they do. I was interested in the original verse from the Torah in regards to Exodus 12, verse 17 through 20. And he goes on to say in verse 17 and 18, we see reference to matzah as unleavened bread. However, in verse 19, the third Hebrew word is seor, and that is also translated leaven. So later in the verse, we see variants of the Hebrew word hamatz, and also translated as leaven. So both words seor and hamatz mean leaven. So both words seor and hamatz mean leaven. Hamatz means to leaven, flour dough rising because of yeast fermentation, but it also has a meaning of sour and degenerate. We think of hamatz as the finished product, leavened bread. Seor, again translated as to leaven. But look at what it also means, y'all. Seor, again translated as leaven, also has the meaning to be left over, to remain. So we saw with the feeding of the 4,000, there was much leaven, much left over. And that's why I wanted to share this blog post just for that part, because I found that very interesting. So seor means to leaven, but it also means to be left over or to remain. Thus, the feeding of the 5,000 only had enough left over to show everyone's hunger was satisfied. And the 4,000 had an abundance of leaven left over to fill 7 duffel-sized baskets. When you have that many leftovers, something is wrong. And thinking about the wilderness tabernacle, we need to also remember there were 2 sources of bread in the wilderness tabernacle. We had the jar of manna, did we not? And the jar of manna was before the Ark of the Covenant. And we also had the table of showbread before the face of Yah. So in the holy place was a table of showbread before the face of Yah. And the jar of manna was in the Holy of Holies before the Ark of the Covenant. And this is really cool. The picture to your right, notice the table designed to hold the showbread. The leavened loaves sat on pipes so that they could breathe. Matthew Nolan has an old teaching on this that I would encourage you to watch. It is a teaching he did at Passion for Truth, and it's titled Table of Showbread, Gifts of the Spirit. So he talks about these pipes. Can you see them? And, you know, this is very rare. I mean, when he has a picture that he shows in that presentation, but I was really excited to see this particular picture because you can see the pipes, you know, because even leavened bread, after it's baked, it still needs to breathe. And there were 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes. And we face him face to face, Panaim. And so there is so much we can study on leaven. And I'm really glad we started focusing early on the types and shadows of the Passover season. And what we covered today is really foundational. It's the beginning to understand about the leaven and how leaven can be used to build up the body of Messiah, and how also the wrong kind of building up is feeding on the added doctrines of men. So we have to be very mindful of those 2 meanings. And we will get into more about the leaven and the bread as we approach Passover itself, and also the feast of unleavened bread. So we will leave it here for now, but we will bring forth scripture about leaven as we continue to draw closer to Passover. And I pray what we learned today was a blessing. I pray that that it instilled some food for thought. I truly pray that, like myself, I learned something putting this together. And, you know, as you go back, and you can go back to this teaching and look at the various definitions and dig more deeply, be very much aware of all the various definitions, and go back and look at the first mentions of these words and the phrases of these words, and just rejoice in this journey of learning. And I look forward to next Shabbat and learning some more. So I pray to all of you. I hope this was a blessing. And as we prepare for Passover, he was the lamb that was slain in our place. He died for our sins, did he not? Did he not die for the leaven that was in us, those things not pleasing to him? Did he not take our leaven out of us and made us unleavened? And he took our place on that crucifixion tree. So it is a very big deal. It's a key lesson. And I'm not even sure if I did it justice. All I can say is that I tried. I truly tried, because it truly is daunting. And you when you sit down and break bread with brothers and sisters, you really want to do the very best you can. You really want to show all the beautiful aspects of his word and try to understand his covenant commands as best as possible. So I pray we accomplish that. I pray that you have grown in maturity through this teaching that he gave us today. Shabbat Shalom.